All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's webinar featuring foreign correspondent Nick Schifrin. I hope that you all are healthy and well and look forward to hosting you all for tonight's program. My name is Connie Yip and I am the Assistant Director for Programming at the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies. We're thrilled to present this program in collaboration with the education team at the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. The content of this evening's presentation is particularly fitting given today's date, as it is the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protest, which occurred on June 4th, 1989.
We also want to acknowledge that we're in the middle of a pandemic and protests against anti-Black racism across the country and around the world. We appreciate that you're taking time out of your evening to join us. If at any time you need to take a break for yourself, please do so. My name is Joy Mukherjee and I work with the Pulitzer Center. If you haven't already, please type your name in the chat box. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Nick Schifrin. I'll give Nick a moment to say hello.
Hi everyone, Nick Schifrin here, coming at you from my office at home, I suppose, just like all of us. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you, and I want this to be interactive, so I'll say this again when I start, but please interrupt me and we can have a conversation. If the mics are open, if not, we can do this over chat, obviously. But looking forward to talking with you about China and where it's come in the U.S.-China relationship and where it's going.
Great, thank you, Nick. Let's take a look at today's agenda. For the first 10 minutes of our time together, we'll review Zoom features, webinar goals, and then Connie and I will introduce our respective organizations. Then we'll move straight into our presentation with Nick. And as Nick said, as you have questions, go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box, which I'll review a little bit more in depth in our next slide. Then we'll transition into a presentation on classroom recommendations, particularly focused on the middle school and high school classroom. Then we will transition again to our question and answer section, where we will try to answer as many of your questions as we can. And then finally, Connie and I will describe educator resources and upcoming events, and there will be a brief survey for all of you to complete that will help us create programming in the future. So let's go to our Zoom features. So many of you are very familiar with Zoom at this point. For those of you who spend 80% of your day on Zoom, bear with me. I do want to review some of the features that are pertinent to this particular conversation. So you'll notice that your video is off and your microphone is off. They are going to remain off for the duration of this webinar. We still want you to participate, and you can do that using the Q&A box and the chat box. So the chat box will be used to engage in conversation with the community here today. We have a really diverse audience, and we encourage you to share ideas and comments using these features. We've also noticed that a lot of educators have shared their ideas on how they want to bring reporting into the classroom and have gotten feedback from their colleagues. So we really encourage you to speak and share with your colleagues. The other feature that we're going to use today is the Q&A box, and it's a place for you to post questions for Nick, and Connie and I will be monitoring your questions throughout the conversation. We encourage you to submit questions as they arise, and we'll collect them and bring them up as they're relevant. Let's go over some of the goals today for this webinar. So we have 4 central goals. We'll be exploring the Pulitzer Center's mission, education programs, and educational resources. We'll be exploring the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies, mission, programs, and resources as well. We'll also explore Nick Schifrin's reporting project, China, Power, and Prosperity. And then finally, we'll introduce tips on how educators can use Nick Schifrin's reporting on China in the classroom. Now we're going to hear from Connie about the Center for East Asian Studies. Connie?
Thank you, Joya. So the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies is an interdisciplinary nexus, clearinghouse, and resource for academic exploration and support related to the study of China, Japan, and Korea. As a Title VI National Resource Center designated by the U.S. Department of Education, we sponsor a variety of activities, including public lectures, workshops, conferences, film series, cultural events, and K through 16 outreach initiatives, including events such as this one. And then in collaboration with other international area studies centers at the University of Chicago, we are pleased to support professional development opportunities for educators to examine ways to bring international content into classrooms. In these uncertain times, it is more important than ever to foster understanding of diverse perspectives, both domestically and from across the globe. This webinar is actually the first in a three-part series with the Pulitzer Center and the University of Chicago Center for Middle Eastern Studies and Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies, entitled Global Views, a summer 2020 series. We will have information at the end of the program today about upcoming programming, as well as instructions for obtaining relevant professional development credits for Illinois public school teachers attending these webinars. I'll just pass things back over to Joya.
Thank you, Connie. The Pulitzer Center was founded in response to a changing media landscape. More people are getting their news online, and while this means increased access and diversity of voices, it also means oversaturation. This has led to reduced funding for in-depth coverage of systemic global issues. As a response to that, the Pulitzer Center raises awareness of underreported global issues through direct support for quality journalism across all media platforms and a unique program of education and public outreach. We support journalists covering underreported stories by providing funding for their projects and developing programming to introduce their reporting to the public. On the next slide, we're going to see some topics that journalists have investigated with Pulitzer Center grants. I want to take a moment on this slide for everyone to take a look. Is there a subject or an issue that is particularly relevant to you and your interests? If so, share it in the chat box. I'd love to get to know you a little bit more and what issues you gravitate to. Let's go to the next slide now. Thank you. Once journalists publish their work, we bring that reporting to classroom and universities across the country, driven by a mission to cultivate a more curious, informed, empathetic, and engaged public by connecting students and teachers with underreported global news stories and the journalists who cover them. We uphold this mission by providing programming and resources to educators and students in a number of ways. First and foremost, we offer thousands of articles, photos, and videos on underreported issues that are accessible on our website. We also have developed hundreds of lesson plans and student contests for educators to bring into their classrooms and for students to engage with. We also offer virtual journalist visits for any educator who is interested in hosting a journalist in their classroom. And lastly, we offer workshops for both students and teachers. One of those reporters that we work with is Nick Schifrin. Nick is PBS NewsHour's Foreign Affairs Correspondent. He has created week-long, in-depth series for a NewsHour from Russia, Ukraine, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, Cuba, Mexico, and the Baltics. The series Inside Putin's Russia won a 2018 Peabody Award. Prior to PBS, Schifrin was Al Jazeera America's Middle East correspondent. He has reported for more than 40 countries, covering every major story in the Middle East, as well as the war against Boko Haram in Nigeria. He led the channel's coverage of the 2014 war in Gaza, reported extensively on the Syrian war from Syria's Turkish, Lebanese, and Jordanian borders, and covered the conflict in and annexation of Crimea. He won an Overseas Press Club award for his Gaza coverage and a National Headliners Award for his Ukraine coverage. Let's welcome Nick Schifrin again.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that kind introduction. And I'm really happy to be talking to you guys about the next project that was in our Pulitzer grant. Got about 5 or 6 in the last 5 years, which is China, Power, and Prosperity. And you'll see why we called it that as I talk for the next 20 or 25 minutes or so. We did 2 trips to China last year and created 10 stories, covered everything from Xi Jinping to Uyghurs to Hong Kong to green cars in China to the young and rich and the level of Chinese prosperity that is certainly new in the last couple decades compared to the past. And so it is a fundamentally different country in the last 10 years or so than it has been in the past. I think most scholars would agree with that. And certainly everybody would say right now that the US-China relationship has fundamentally changed in the last 2 or 3 years. And that's only accelerated because of the coronavirus, because of the tensions between Washington and Beijing over COVID-19. And so that's the frame of what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 or so minutes. I am looking at the chat, and if there's a way for you guys to interrupt, so to speak, please try. Otherwise, I can just keep going, and then we'll have a Q&A. But I do want to get to that Q&A to hear your questions and to talk about China, but also, you know, teaching China, and what that might look like. So let's take a look at what I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, probably most time on, which is, oh, that's right. Sorry, I had a bio. Just the bio, I wanted to show a photo of myself probably about 14 years ago in Baghdad when I had much blacker hair. And just mention that I started as an overnight desk assistant, and I've lived in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the UK, Israel, and I've reported from more than 40 countries, Jaya said. But I put the desk assistant there because I'm actually proud of it. My first job at ABC News was from midnight to 9 a.m., getting people's coffee and getting numbers on scripts back when there were scripts. And the anchors actually needed pieces of paper, and I used to number them and try not to fall asleep. So anyway, on to the content. And so the main push I want to give you guys is about Xi Jinping, because I think what I'm going to say thematically about Xi Jinping is actually what China is today. And I think there is just no doubt that he is a different kind of leader than has preceded him. So a couple of points here. I've got on the top of there, strongest Chinese leader since Mao. Now, what does that mean? So as we all know, or probably know, Chairman Mao created communist China. He literally birthed it. But not only that, he became a tyrant. Millions of people were killed later on. But at the beginning, that's what this phrase means, strongest leader since Mao. Mao created the idea of what China should be. In this case, the Communist Chinese Party leading modern China. He created the notions, the philosophy of what post-1949 China should look like. And while Xi Jinping would probably disagree with me if he were with us here, I think it's pretty clear that Xi Jinping is trying to create the new rules, trying to create the new China, trying to create the new philosophies under which China will live. And so the most obvious one is him. He has removed term limits. He is the president, the commander-in-chief, and the head of the party. He could be in charge for the rest of his life. And one of his predecessors, Deng Xiaoping, very famously talked about collective leadership, talked about no one person being around forever. That was a response to what Mao did in his later years. And Deng Xiaoping talked about no one person should have all the power. Xi Jinping has rejected that. And the collective leadership that existed at the top of the Communist Party, certainly in the 70s and 80s, up until Tiananmen Square, which we mourn that anniversary today. But even still, that collective leadership lasted through the 90s and 2000s. It's largely gone. Xi Jinping has taken control, like I said, not only of the army, the party, and country as president, but the way the Chinese government works is there's lots of leading small group, LSGs is what they call it, but it's basically the equivalent of our kind of congressional committees. And in the past, US-China relations was one of those committees. Regional relations was one of those committees, and every committee would have a different head, and they would all report up to the Politburo Standing Committee, the 7-person team at the top. But Xi Jinping is the head of all those leading small groups. And so it'll just give you an example of how much centralization there has been. And so again, the theme of what I want to talk about is what he has done to the country and what that all means. And so I've put new nationalism or revitalized nationalism here. And just very briefly, I'll just touch on a couple of points on that. The fastest military modernization in world history is probably China's in the last 15 years. You could argue it's Germany between World War I and World War II and what Hitler was able to create for World War II. But I mean, other than that, and that's in dispute, it really is the fastest peacetime modernization in world history. And it's not about increasing the size of the military, it is about increasing the quality of the military. And the Chinese have spent a lot of money and a lot of time doing that, and they have catered that modernization specifically to counter the United States. You might think that's obvious. The United States is the leading military power in the world and therefore leading military power in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. But it's been very overt how much the Chinese military talks about what it's doing in the context of the United States. So that revitalized nationalism, one thing is the military. But the other thing is what I'm going to call wolf warrior. And I strongly urge you guys to watch this movie called Wolf Warrior 2, which is the most popular movie in Chinese history. To say it's nationalist is to call Rambo, a 1980s Cold War hero. I mean, that's the kind of sense that Wolf Warrior gets across in the country, a pride in that military, a pride in a level of economic prosperity that we'll talk about, and a pride in world presence. And I bring it up specifically, and I'll get to this under COVID, but there is now a phrase, wolf warrior diplomacy. So the diplomats in Beijing are now dubbed wolf warrior diplomats. Again, a proud sense that they can criticize the United States and criticize anybody who criticizes China, and certainly the Communist Party. And I can see that Wolf Warrior 1 and 2 are available in the film library. So go and watch it. And so that is about a notion of what China is in the world, giving out the idea that China is strong, China is powerful, China is influential, China is everywhere. That idea existed before Xi Jinping, but the acceleration of it has been dramatic since 2012, since he became president. And I really do think that that's one of the hallmarks of the Xi Jinping era and modern China, and we'll go into some of that a little bit more. And so we've talked about the military, we've talked about this notion of wolf warrior and this world presence that we'll talk about. And it's also internal, though. I mean, we really should briefly mention that. And so one version of it is the silencing of dissent. Whether you are a lawyer who has represented critics of the government, you're a journalist who's written critically of the government, exposed corruption, perhaps. Even if you're a party member who isn't falling in line with Xi Jinping, a lot of those people have disappeared in the last 8 or 9 years. The space for dissent was never large to begin with. It's virtually zero right now. And so thematically, that dissent has come, that silencing dissent has come along with the return of the party as prime in the country. The real use of the party as the guiding light, if you will. So private companies now have members of the party as part of their boards. The party is discussed more in public by government officials. The party is tied to foreign policy, tied to military strategy. And so the party itself gains that primacy as the dissent is silenced. I've given you kind of the military version of Xi, but I could also give you the state media version of Xi Jinping. They have called him Xi Dada. The best translation for that is Papa Xi. It's not quite father, it's not quite dad, it's Papa. It's this notion that frankly comes out of most authoritarian countries. Vladimir Putin has certainly cultivated this, the notion that there's a benign leader at the top who cares about you. And if there are any problems, well, certainly the local government screwed that up, because if Xi Jinping knew about what was going on, he would fix it. And so there is that holding him up, almost a cult of Xi. It's reduced a little bit in the last year, but certainly 3-4 years ago, you'd go around and you'd see Xi Jinping everywhere. You'd watch the media and it was only Xi Jinping eating with farmers, hanging out with farmers, walking the countryside. And so these are the themes that really run through modern China. The notion of Xi Jinping as the strongest leader since Mao, the centralized authority of Xi Jinping, the nationalism which comes with the military, comes with that wolf warrior sense of self around the world, and then internally the silencing of dissent and the celebration of Xi as Papa Xi. So for the rest, I'm just going to go through some of these a little faster, but that's the real frame that I want everyone to have, and we can absolutely talk about all of these options. So obviously, what has accelerated everything when it comes to what China is, US-China relations, why you and I are talking like this rather than in person. I've done these events in person in Chicago. We all miss those, I'm sure. Is the biggest medical crisis in the world in 100 years, which has created the biggest geopolitical crisis, certainly between the United States and anyone other than the Soviet Union, probably in 30 or 40 years. And so I wanted to stay internal to China for a minute and just discuss what has and hasn't happened. So there's a lot of stories I'm sure you've read about where COVID-19 came from and what the government has or hasn't done when it came to COVID-19. I want to use a person, and I'll use people throughout the next few minutes to discuss this, because I think it's the easiest way to understand and to remember. So that is Dr. Ai Fen. She is the head of emergency medicine at Wuhan Central Hospital. Now, Wuhan is the capital of the province Hubei. This is a big place. Wuhan has 12 million people, 11 million people. And so when you think about the origins of COVID-19, don't think of like a little village or something. This is a major, major city. And in the center of that city, in mid to late December, Ai Fen and her colleagues start treating what they thought was pneumonia. Of course, it turned out that it wasn't. Now, Dr. Ai Fen, whose name you probably don't know, although maybe some of you who've been reading a lot have, is not as famous as Dr. Li Wenliang. He is the man who's described as the whistleblower, the person who first alerted authorities, was silenced, and then died from COVID-19 as he was treating patients. Dr. Li Wenliang got his information from Dr. Ai Fen, and Dr. Ai Fen gave an interview a few months later, of course, which has been censored in China, in which she said, "I am not the whistleblower, but I provided the whistle." And so what she did, and this is, I think, really the key to understanding what China did and did not do when it came to COVID-19, in late December, she called all of her friends in labs, private labs and government labs, and says, something's new, something's up, something's different. She sent out samples. All of those scientists and all of the doctors who worked with her tried to figure out what was happening, tried to sound the alarm, tried to see, hey, can we help? There were dozens and dozens and dozens of scientists who, between December 26th and January 3rd, posted into a global database for genomes, samples after samples after samples. They were coming in every day, thanks to Dr. Ai Fen and her hospital workers who were providing these samples. The scientists posted. Dr. Ai Fen, other doctors said, hey, this is going to be human-to-human transmission. That was the key. This is not just pneumonia. This is not just something. This is SARS. They thought it was another version of SARS. And they pushed the alarm. And on January 1st and on January 2nd and on January 3rd, the weight of first the local Communist Party and then the weight of Beijing came down. And so when you think about what China is today and how it relates to COVID-19, I want you to remember Dr. Ai Fen that I write scientists versus the government. The scientists, the doctors did in those first days try and reach out, even including to some Western scientists and doctors who they had deep relationships with. The first people to crack down were the hospital administrators. Second people to crack down were the local government. And then the third was Beijing. I will write her name as requested, Dr. I. And the hospital administrator said, you don't know what this is, don't cause panic. The local government said, you don't know what this is, don't cause panic, and we've got a really important Communist Party event coming up next week, so it would really be better if none of this was happening. And then a few days later, Xi Jinping and the Beijing government says, you know, it would really be better if we don't quite share as much as we know yet. Now, there's a lot of dispute about why all of those various stakeholders did that. But I would argue it's two things. When it comes to local governments in modern Chinese history, there are multiple examples of local governments being too scared to report up to Beijing, being too fearful of telling the truth publicly, because they have been taught, they have been trained not to rock the national boat and not to rock the party's boat. And then Beijing, again, the instincts are still, even though they have gotten better, according to the scientists and the doctors and all the experts I talk to, but the instincts are still cover, silence, figure it out, decide what we want to put out. It is the opposite of the culture of reporting up, reporting out, helping people understand. And my little dialogue here has nothing to do with how the US responded, right? It's another topic. I'm happy to engage with that as well. And I'm not saying anything about, you know, the failure of the US response subsequently, right? February, March. But in early January, it's hard to argue that first hospital administrators, then the local government, then Beijing, really did, for a crucial number of weeks, instinctually tell everyone, don't share. And what I would say, just to put a cap on this before we move on, is, I think I referenced this, local governments have been accused of not sharing in the past. There was an earthquake, 2008, 10,000 children died because of badly constructed schools. And it took years, and it took very, very famous activists to get that information out. But Xi Jinping has throttled the local governments more than they ever were. And so that's what's changed, and that's what's shifted. So let me go through a couple other examples of kind of modern China, and then we can get to questions. So human rights is something that you'll hear a lot of people who control, people who criticize the Communist Party. And I see I got a question coming in now. Why don't I keep going, and then I'll come back to it. But please throw out questions, and we'll get to Q&A formally in a few minutes. Just to briefly touch on a few of these, you've probably heard more than 1 million Muslim Uyghurs who live in Western China have been thrown in what the Chinese call re-education camps. In fact, they're detention camps. And this is an attempt, again, to silence dissent. And dissent in this case is a whole category of people who don't speak Mandarin Chinese, people who are not Han Chinese, the ethnicity of 90% of the country, and people who are in the way of expansion plans. And that's how China views its minorities in Western China, and those are the Uyghurs, which I'm happy to talk about more. But I imagine you're relatively familiar with them. Hong Kong, for the first time since Tiananmen Square, I suppose, Hong Kong authorities today are not allowing a vigil for Tiananmen Square, which has been happening since the massacre. And in the last few weeks, Beijing has created a legislative path to turning Hong Kong into another city in mainland China when it comes to laws. You may know there's a 50-year deal that China and the United Kingdom signed in 1997 for Hong Kong to maintain its British laws, British judiciary, even if Beijing controlled foreign policy. That is being eroded. And so the protests you see in Hong Kong are fighting back against that. And I mentioned journalists and lawyers, anybody who represents dissidents, anybody who's written critically, those people end up on the wrong side of Chinese authorities. And so that is, again, one of the hallmarks of recent years China. But at the same time, we have this other huge category, which is trade, on the next slide. And this is what is being lost as a ballast. I think this is the most important thing to understand about trade. So the US complains for years and years and years about Chinese trade practices, right? They said it first started as copycats. Think of, I don't know, Walmart rather than Walmart. Sports cam, not GoPro. These are things that, like, we all know, right? Oh, it's a Chinese doodad and it looks the same as the real thing, and it's a tenth of the price. But the US says that converted to industrial theft, things like military planes, nuclear power plants, and it accelerated Chinese ability. And I think that the phase one trade deal is an example of what has been holding the US and China together, meaning when other things go bad, when the human rights go bad, when the relationship between the heads of the countries go bad, we've had this integrated relationship between American companies and Chinese factories. And that's what the US and China have relied on as a crutch. When things got bad in the past, that's what everyone went back to. The business community had a big voice and said, look, we have to stay close to China. We have to keep on our relationship with China because everyone's making money. Our stuff in Walmart is so much cheaper. The supply chains are better. Everything is more efficient if the US and China are economically integrated. And that is the deal, the bet, really, that I would argue the late Clinton administration and the early George W. Bush administration made. It is the Trump administration and the very end of the Obama administration that said that's not really working. And so I put phase one still alive because, frankly, it seems like the president might walk away from it, and it seems like Beijing might walk away from it. So that's an example of what used to be the ballast in that relationship really beginning to erode. Which brings us to the expansion of Chinese presence. I just want to highlight a couple of people on the right. So this is the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'll highlight the person on top who is Minister Luhut, as he's known, on the left, the taller gentleman in the top photo with China's foreign minister, and the bottom photo is the 93-year-old former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad. And I highlight these two guys because they are a perfect example of what is happening globally right now. So Luhut invited the Chinese, as you can see, to build railroads, to build telephone infrastructure. Huawei, I'm sure, is something that you've heard of quite a bit. Modern technology into a country that didn't have it, and modern railroads into a country that didn't have it. The person on the bottom, Mahathir, when he was reelected Prime Minister of Malaysia, said nothing from China is allowed in. I'm going to freeze all the contracts, and I'm going to stop all of the Chinese telecommunications giants from coming in because I don't trust them. And so we can talk more about this, but there is a global battle right now between countries that want technology and want infrastructure. And the Chinese are offering it in very relatively cheap packages, and packages that are better packaged, if you will, than the West has. Cheaper phone technology, 5G that's subsidized by the Chinese government, loans that don't have to be paid back for many years, things that Western companies that have to answer to shareholders and markets just don't have the ability to. But Mahathir represents what the US wants, which is the argument that, well, this might be cheaper, but it's not good for us. There's not enough local workers being employed by Belt and Road Initiative, and there's too much technology going from Huawei, if you install it in my country, back to Beijing. But even Mahathir points one thing out, that the West just doesn't have the alternative, doesn't have the package of technology, the package of railroads, when the Chinese have really been doing this for years. And so that's, I think I'll probably leave it there. Let me just show you some themes here overall, just to keep in mind. Leadership, I talked about Xi Jinping, this national narrative, the nationalization, the nationalism that's come in, economy, trade, again, that ballast that has existed being lost. Technology, we talked about telecommunications, artificial intelligence is another one where the West is really trying to push back, and China's pouring money into something, and they're frankly speeding ahead. And human rights, of course, civil liberties inside of mainland China, and this legislation in Hong Kong that is eroding the freedoms in Hong Kong. So I got a little quick there at the end, I apologize, but why don't I push it back to you guys, and we can go through all these questions.
Great. Before we let's get to some of these questions. Connie, do you have a question that you'd like to start with?
Yes, I mean, considering we are actually had mentioned the Tiananmen Square massacre, and I know that someone asked a question earlier about, given President Trump's recent desire to potentially have military action here, given the recent protest, just your thoughts on why, since it's the 31st anniversary, why maybe something like that in our history has not been brought back up into the current situation as kind of like a comparison.
A comparison to what's happening in China, or a comparison to what's happening in the West? What's
happening here in comparison to how it, took place in China, in 1989.
So, I'm not the Russians would call it a whataboutism. I'm not gonna kind of compare what happened in Lafayette Park to Tiananmen Square. Again, I don't want to get political about this administration beyond what I'm going to say about U.S.-China relations. But some people are making that comparison that we had peaceful protesters pushed out of Lafayette Park on the same week, certainly, and within 24 hours of the administration, very vociferously complaining about what Beijing did to peaceful protesters in 1989. What I will say is what's happening in Hong Kong is a sign that there's very little that the U.S. can do to push back against what Beijing is after. And Beijing and Xi Jinping has made it totally clear that Hong Kong will be part of mainland China. I mean, that's the deal they signed, and that it would take 50 years. But Xi Jinping has made it very clear he's not going to wait for 50 years. And this legislation that the National Party Congress, they didn't pass it, they passed a legislative pathway to create this legislation. And basically, like I said, it will create the kinds of surveillance, the kinds of stifling of dissent, the kinds of, frankly, fear among the population that exists in mainland China. And that's what Beijing wants. And what's so interesting is that the U.S., President Trump came out last week and declared this big response and said we're ending the special relationship that the U.S. has had with Hong Kong since the early 90s. But Beijing will continue to do that. And partially the problem is that the U.S. can hurt itself depending on how it responds. There's 1,300 American businesses in Hong Kong. Tens of thousands of Americans live there. It has been a business safe haven. And so far, the businesses who are in Hong Kong have said they will stay despite the national security legislation that Beijing is talking about. And so there's very little the U.S. can do to stop Beijing from taking over the kind of sense of Hong Kong that Hong Kong has had for so long, and today is a perfect example of that. That for the first time since '89, that Hong Kong residents were not allowed to have their candlelight vigil in a park in the middle of the city, mourning, the '89 crackdown. And so that is the future of Hong Kong, no matter what we do about it.
Great, thank you, Nick. We have a number of questions about COVID-19 in China, so I'm going to ask you a couple. We can just stay on this topic for a moment. Do you have any insight on whether COVID-19 originated in nature or in a Wuhan lab?
So the easy answer to that is there is no evidence that COVID-19 started in a lab. And most scientists believe it most likely jumped from an animal to human in nature somewhere, perhaps a so-called wet market, which is a bit of a misnomer in the sense that it's a market that sells lots of things, including live animals. But I will say this, that what the scientists point out is that it could have spread from a lab, that there are and have been problems with biosecurity in China, but also, frankly, in other countries. There was an outbreak in the late '70s of a flu that went around the world that came out of a Russian lab. The CDC has admitted that anthrax was leaked from one of its labs and got a bunch of scientists sick. So there are a lot of people who are using the lab theory as a cudgel against China, as an example of, oh, China's doing a cover-up. There's no evidence. There's no evidence that it came out of a lab. But there are scientists who I talk to who do say, look, it's possible. And when combined with what I've talked about the stifling of dissent, many scientists don't have the confidence that if it did come from a lab, these Chinese scientists, where it happened, would ever be able to admit it. But again, no evidence that it came from a lab.
Great, thank you, Nick. One more COVID question. What are your thoughts on the impact of COVID-19 on altering the supply lines from China? Do you expect the US companies and our government to pull some suppliers back into the US?
Yes, the answer to that is yes. And also think about what was already happening. So even in Hong Kong, this applies. So about 10 years ago, you probably have noticed that, hey, a lot of my stuff is coming from Malaysia or Taiwan or Vietnam. The reason that is that this mecca of supply chains that China suddenly became a little more expensive. China was so reliable because it was providing reliable, cheap labor. That labor has become less cheap in the last 10 or 15 years. The prosperity of China has improved. The middle class has been risen up. Their expectations are higher, and their abilities are higher. And so they are getting paid more than they used to be. And so already we saw the beginnings. I won't use the word decoupling because it's a no-no for many of these experts who I talk to. But the beginning of companies separating from their Chinese supply chains. That's going to accelerate dramatically now. It was already happening. COVID-19 is going to accelerate it. Why? No, a Biden administration, Trump administration, Governor Cuomo or Newsom or a Republican governor anywhere, none of them will ever be able to argue that their masks should come from China. Their gloves should come from China, or frankly, come from anywhere other than in their backyard, or at least Europe or Mexico or something. And so you have the business communities already being worried about Chinese labor costs. You have the political imperative of needing all of that PPE, all of the personal protective equipment and other things to be made in America. And you got this political pressure overall that is Washington versus Beijing. And so, yes, we will see the slow separation. It will be slow, but the slow separation over time of American businesses from their Chinese supply chain.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions before we jump back into classroom connections. It seems to me, this question is from Derek Zhao. It seems to me that a lot of the geopolitical conflicts the US has with China is about political ideology, different conceptualizations of democracy. According to your news reporting, how do citizens in China in their everyday lives make sense of democracy?
Yes, I mean, I would never argue that anyone's culture forbids an understanding or an embrace of democracy. I think that's, I just don't believe that. What is happening though is, as you point out, an ideological battle. So Xi Jinping and the Communist Party frames it ideologically. If you watch Chinese state television, Mandarin, but also in English, you will hear anchors arguing this, that, you know, when COVID-19 came from Wuhan, the strong central government of Beijing helped the people of Wuhan. And then you will see Governor Cuomo on TV on this Chinese media clip saying, "Where's the federal government? You know, where are my ventilators?" And then cut back to Chinese anchor and say, "See, our system is better." That's one side. And then you have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo overtly making it ideological. And he has been for decades. He's, you know, this is something he's always believed in, but he's got the biggest megaphone in the world right now when it comes to China. And he says, this is the problem with authoritarianism. This is the problem with communism. The president, of course, wants to make it about socialism and about part of the campaign. And so you have this big ideological argument from both sides. The reality, of course, is a little messier. That the US-China relationship has been lots of things, regardless of how much democracy is in China. And the ideological differences between the United States and China has not stopped businesses from relying on China for 3 decades. And so when it comes to Chinese people, of course they know, you know, some of the systems that are in the West. They're not allowed to read about everything, but they certainly know it exists. And there's nothing in Chinese culture that prevents, you know, them from understanding or embracing democracy. There is, though, the Chinese Communist Party. And if there's anything that Xi Jinping shows, it is that one of, if not the main motivators, is the survival of the Chinese Communist Party. And in Xi Jinping's mind, that means no dissent and certainly no democracy.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Just one last question. Maybe if you could touch on a little bit about the Uyghur situation that's, you know, been happening. That was a brief question that someone submitted in the Q&A.
Yeah, so I'll be brief. As I mentioned before, there are about 1 million, maybe more, Muslim Uyghurs in what the Chinese government calls re-education camps. And so this is a culture, these are a people that have existed outside the traditional Han Chinese. Han Chinese is about 90% of modern China. Uyghurs, I think it's 1% or 2%, I forget exactly the number. But the Chinese government accuses them of being separatists. And they've used certain incidents. 2009, there was a big riot in the capital of Xinjiang, which is the state in the west where most Uyghurs live. There was a riot there. A lot of Han Chinese died. There are Uyghur terrorist groups affiliated with Al Qaeda who have attacked Tiananmen Square and another couple of famous attacks. And so what the Chinese said, what Xi Jinping's version of China says is, I can brook no alternative culture, no alternative people. That's what it seems to be the motivation. And so the Uyghurs speak a different language. They eat different food. They even look different. You could argue, depending on where their ancestry is from. The language is Turkic. And obviously as Muslims, they're in the minority compared to the rest of the country. And so they've been systematically targeted, thrown into detention camps. Whole families have disappeared. I've interviewed woman in her 70s who fled to Istanbul, 17 children and grandkids, all of them are gone. Has not talked to them in 3 years. Disappeared into camps, detention facilities, maybe some of them are dead. She just doesn't know. She hasn't talked to them. And so it's really extraordinary what has happened. The US calls it cultural genocide and calls it kind of the crime of the 21st century. And I should though say, again, the Chinese say that these are separatists, they're terrorists, and they need to be re-educated, literally. They need to be taught Mandarin Chinese. They need to be kind of re-educated in the realm of the Communist Party. And so that is what's happening. And the Chinese now say that some of them have gotten out of those camps, but as far as the international researchers have said, a lot of people are still missing. Some of them ended up even forced into factories that were started up during COVID-19. But we don't know a lot about what's happened to a lot of people, and it is truly shocking.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. I want to keep you available to add your ideas and your opinions into our classroom connections. Just a note for attendees, I think we're going to be running about 10 minutes over. I do want to make sure that I address how accessible Nick's reporting project is for the classroom. So Nick's reporting project, China, Barbarism, and Prosperity, is available on the Pulitzer website, and it's uniquely accessible to the classroom setting, specifically middle school and high school. The structure includes 13 compelling 12-minute video segments with accompanying transcripts, each exploring a separate topic. And so the way that this reporting project is organized allows for these different segments to be grouped to focus on different themes, the themes, for example, that Nick reviewed earlier, or studied as a series in sequence, which allows for a lot of flexibility for educators in their approach. It also allows for a lot of differentiation and scaffolding, because the center of every piece or every article is a very engaging video. You can differentiate to students' learning levels as well as their interests. The topics of each article and each video also cover multiple angles and perspectives, which really opens up the content to spirited debate, discussion, and inquiry, project-based learning. So definitely an educator has a lot of opportunities in the classroom to incorporate the project in different ways. It also finally develops kind of a global competence for our students, right? A curiosity, awareness, and interest in how the world works. The reporting project takes great pains in connecting the economies and the infrastructures of different countries, as well as creating a connection between technological competition. And so it allows for students to understand the country's interconnectedness and fosters a curiosity for cultures and societies outside of our own. So those are just elements of ways you can bring this into the classroom. If you're an educator that does bring this reporting into your classroom, please connect with me. I would love to hear how you do it. Thank you, Myra. So Nick, I'm gonna bring this back to you. I wanna thank you so much for your time today. In the chat box, let's all give him a round of applause. Thank you so much. If you have any final words, please share them with us.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is, as I usually end with when it comes to these, is something really for your students, but for all of us, is that, I really do encourage people to reach out, and I try and help in any way possible. I am here because of my mentors. And as my father would say, mentorship is the only shortcut to success. And so if you think that there's anyone that I can be a mentor to, I'm happy to do that in any way, whether it's based on the content or just based on my own experiences. So Anyway, so thank you for listening, and I'm always happy to be in touch with anybody who wants to reach out.
Thank you, Nick. We'd like to conclude this webinar today with a brief overview of resources we have for educators and students. Please stick around for our post-webinar survey, which is going to pop up at the very end of this webinar. It helps us to continue to develop engaging programming for all of you. If you're an educator or a student interested in any of the Pulitzer Center's opportunities or resources, please visit us at pulitzercenter.org/education. We offer hundreds of lesson plans on a range of reporting issues for all different learning levels on our lesson builder. If you're interested in instructional plans or activities, please visit us at pulitzercenter.org/builder. In response to stay-at-home orders, we adapted many of our digital lesson plans into printable lesson plans. Those are also available on our website. If you're interested in exploring reporting like Nick's on your own or in your classroom, you can access all of his reporting at pulitzercenter.org/reporting and the reporting of many other grantees. And if you're interested in hosting a journalist like Nick in your classroom, please contact us at education@pulitzercenter.org. As Connie mentioned earlier, we do have some upcoming webinars that I'd like to highlight today. Next Thursday, at the same time as this webinar, we are chatting with investigative reporter Mei Jiang on her reporting in Afghanistan. That event will be exactly 1 week from now at the same time. The following Thursday, we're featuring writer and analyst Nina Jankowicz in a discussion on the impact of disinformation on the 2019 Ukrainian elections. We'll also be comparing the impact of disinformation on the elections in Ukraine to our upcoming elections. And before I turn this over to Connie again, I'd like to invite all of you to connect with me through education@pulitzercenter.org. We are always interested in connecting with educators and students who are interested in working with underreported stories. Now, Pulitzer Center is based in Washington, D.C., but I'm based here, and I am interested in expanding our programming in the Chicagoland area with educators that work in private schools, public schools, or charter schools. So if you're interested in collaborating, hosting journalists, or want to know more about our reporting projects and our instructional plans, you can email me at jmukherjee@pulitzercenter.org. And finally, we have a weekly education newsletter for educators. If you're interested in subscribing, please visit us at the above link. And I'm going to turn it over to Connie again. Thank you.
Thanks, Joya. And thank you all again for attending tonight's webinar with this very special thank you to Nick Schifrin. As a reminder, tonight's webinar is part of the series Global Views, a summer 2020 series for educators, and is brought to you by UChicago Area Studies Center and the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. To learn more and to register to attend the next webinar within the series taking place June 11th and the final one taking place June 18th, please visit the UChicago Educator Outreach website at educatoroutreach.uchicago.edu. If you are a teacher in an Illinois public school, please be sure to email me directly at cyip@uchicago.edu regarding obtaining an ISBE professional development credit for today's webinar. Today's webinar equates to 1 credit for the duration of this evening's 1-hour program. Please note that we are only able to provide professional development credits for Illinois public school teachers. Once we receive your email, you'll get additional information on your evaluation and evidence of completion to obtain your professional development credit. Certificates of participation will be available upon request for private school teachers and non-Illinois public school teachers. So please email me directly regarding this request as well. We also want to announce this year's Summer Institute for Educators, reporting on public health challenges, solutions, and lessons learned that will take place on June 25th and in 26 as a Zoom webinar from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. each day. We welcome and encourage you to sign up for this 2-day virtual conference for educators, which brings together award-winning journalists supported by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and digital educational resources created by the Pulitzer Center and UChicago to explore how reporting on past public health crises throughout the world can offer valuable insights on the challenges presented by COVID-19. Information pertaining to this online is again accessible by visiting the UChicago Educator Outreach website. Tonight's webinar series and the Summer Institute for Educators Conference is supported by Title VI National Resource Center grants from the U.S. Department of Education. And finally, for those interested specifically in East Asian Studies, please be sure to visit our website at ceas.uchicago.edu. That's ceas.uchicago.edu. We have dedicated pages in the outreach section for educators that provide resources related to East Asia. We encourage you to sign up to receive informational emails, and we're also very active on our social media, so please like and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. So thank you all again for joining us this evening. Continue to be safe and well, and we look forward to hosting everyone again at another upcoming UChicago Educator Outreach Initiative. And please remember to complete the post-webinar survey. Thank you so much.